When the war broke out, I belonged to St John Ambulance Brigade, and I'd been called up for the militia, and I avoided it by I was at an engineering school in Fetter Lane in London, and
Oh, so you're in London then when the war broke out?
no, it was only for 3 months at the time I was called up, and somebody said, apply for the Air Force and they won't call you up because they got too many, they don't want them. And everybody wants to go in it, so if you apply, it'll take a long time and you won't get called up. So I put in to join the Air Force. And at the same time, when I was in Bournemouth, I was in the St John Ambulance Brigade, and we used to do duties in the cinemas and football matches and events, and there was good comradeship in it, and it was lots of nice people, you know, and it was, of the organisations, I preferred it to those like the Scouts and the other things which you had to swear for king and country and all that bull. So one day somebody came along to us when we used to have a weekly parade or a weekly, you know, get together in St John, where we had either lessons or drills or so on, and we used to get allocated duties. And this person came along and said, if you join the military hospital reserve, you'll get a fortnight's holiday away, and you'll get paid for it as well, and you'll enjoy it, and it's well worth joining. So all of us thought, well, that sounds all right, you know. We couldn't afford a holiday at all. We're mostly apprentices and not well paid. So we all joined it. And of course, on September the 3rd, when the war broke out, we all discovered we were in the army. And I didn't particularly want to be in the army, so I tried to join the Navy. And I went to Portsmouth to join the Navy. And so did hundreds of others. And there was I know now, he was a petty officer, you know. He stood on a box and wanted to know, what do you bloody lot want? He said, we want to join the Navy. He said, well, you can all piss off, because we're not taking anybody except radiographers and learner radiographers. So they all went, and I stood there, and I hadn't got a clue what a radiographer was. I thought it was something to do with radio, and I thought, well, I qualify for that, I'm interested in radio. And he said, what do you want? So I said, I am a learner radiographer. And he said, what do you know about radiography? I said, well, not much, I'm a learner. He said, well, you can bugger off as well. So that was the end of and the next day I was up to Aldershot and in the army. And then that's where we got all our equipment and kit and dished out, and by the logic of the British Army, we were trained soldiers. I was in the military hospital reserve in St John Ambulance Brigade, and I wasn't really aware that I was linked with the army in any way. It was somebody came along to one of the St John weekly meetings where we used to get our allocation of duties and things, and he said, what you lads ought to join is the military hospital reserve. You get 2 weeks holiday and you get full pay, and he said, every year, and he said, and you don't have to do anything. It's a great thing. And you know, you're with a lot of your friends and they all say, well, it sounds all right, we'll have a go. And all you do is sign this bloody bit of paper. That's what we did. We all end up right on the medical corps. And I reckon it was even worse than that. When we got into the medical corps, of course, we joined, you know, in our case, we joined 164th Field Ambulance, but they were the better soldiers. They could salute, and they could, you know, and march, and they could do all those things. We were not good at it. We were St John Ambulance, we were mediocre. But we could do the medical things, and they bloody couldn't. So the strength of the Medical Corps came from St John Ambulance and Red Cross and St Andrew and the amateurs in the, and we were the better medical staff than the army. Not the officers, we are good officers. There it is. Because when we were kitted out, because we were reserves, we were trained soldiers, although none of us had ever been in the army before, you see. And being trained soldiers, naturally, we could be posted straight to active service. And one day they lined us all up and in alphabetical order, and they went along, you know. First 36, you go to the 164th West Lancashire Field Ambulance in Liverpool. You get your travel warrant, off you go. That's how we were in. And then by the end of September, we were in France, in Armentières. And that was the phony war.
But did you have any training at all to be a soldier?
No, not really. But we were qualified in the essential thing for the Medical Corps. We all had nursing qualifications in St John Ambulance Brigade, which qualified us as third-class army tradesmen. And then eventually I got second class and first class as the war went on. But in Armentières it was a very phony war. Well, it was anti-fascist. And then, shortly afterwards, very quickly, they realised it wasn't anti-fascist. It was, well, I don't know, what else could it be? But it wasn't. They said it was a phony war.
Imperialist war.
Well, it was, I suppose. It was an imperialist war. And I suppose Chamberlain, he would have done a deal with Hitler just as he did before, wouldn't he, if he'd have continued.
So when Poland was attacked and the Germans attacked Poland, why was nothing done to help Poland at all?
Well, I would say it was physically impossible. How would it be possible? We were in 5th Division, it was one of the best divisions of the British Army. We couldn't have got there, we couldn't have done anything.
Well, no, to attack Germany on the French
Yeah,
border.
but the French weren't mobilised. It was sudden, wasn't it? The French only came in after Chamberlain and so on, and then they mobilised. The Germans were better fitted to fight the war than we were, really, in the beginning. And their propaganda was far superior to ours.
And the Navy? Could the Navy have sailed
Our
into the
Navy
Baltic?
was all right.
Could they have sailed into the Baltic and shelled German towns? Or
No, they didn't, I don't think so. They were, well, if you'd seen, it was in the beginning of the war that the Graf Spee and they were raiding on the Atlantic and they were beaten. And at Montevideo they were beaten. No, I think the Navy was involved in the war right from the beginning. The army
nothing
was.
could be done to help Poland, though.
Well, I don't think anything was done to help Poland. As I say, I wasn't joking when I said they dropped leaflets on them. That's what the RAF did. Drop leaflets on them. They didn't bomb them.
But they could have bombed them.
They could have done, yeah. But then I think there was a terrible fear of gas and chemical warfare and explosive warfare in the beginning. And they believed that if we'd have started the bombing, we might have lost on it because the Germans had outwitted everybody with their keeping secret what they'd done and what they'd got. And they let lots of rumours go around that they had sort of cardboard tanks and, you know, that sort of rubbish. Bloody good cardboard, wasn't it? The bullets used to bounce off it.
But I'm just wondering why was it that nothing was done to help Poland at the time?
Because they couldn't do it.
Or they didn't want to do it?
Don't know, probably both.
Were there sections in the British establishment that didn't want to fight Germany?
Oh yeah, quite a lot, very strong. There was an organisation called the Link in pre-war, which involved an awful lot of British MPs in it, and they were like a friendship organisation with Germany. And German strength through joy cruises used to come to Britain, you know.
Go back to the Communist Party in the 30s and things. So what was the attitude to the Soviet Union then? It was
very strong from the Soviet Union, very.
And no
doubts.
Doubts about
No,
what's happening?
no.
The Moscow trials.
But that
and all
went through the war. We thought a lot of them during the war.
So that, just to repeat the bit. So what happened when the Russians signed the non-aggression pact with Germany? Was that a big shock to the Communist Party? Or?
Yeah, but they explained it, as I say, by saying that the Russians took the political decision because they were being squeezed out by Britain and France and the others out of working against Germany, about having a pact to stop the Germans. And the Russians felt that it was being done so that they were going to be left out. And that's why they did the non-aggression pact, to save themselves, because they could see. Well, just suppose they'd have not done anything at all. And the French and the British and so on had not done anything to stop the Germans. The Germans would have felt free to attack Poland and attack Russia and do anything, wouldn't they? Thinking that the French and the Belgians and the British would back them rather than stop them, which would have been quite likely, wouldn't it, with the political situation. The division, that's where the Field Ambulance joined the 5th Division, which was the 5th British Infantry Division, and we took up a position along the Belgian border because Belgium was neutral. And we were in Armentières, and lots of the division were around Lille and the big northern France towns, and it was a very enjoyable period. But it was a very, very hard winter.
Poland had been invaded by then?
Poland had been invaded, and the war had settled down to nothing. It was just stagnation.
But no, the British soldiers didn't do anything like attack the Germans or anything?
Dropped leaflets on Germany telling them how naughty they were. And we didn't have any active fighting. We had a lot of manoeuvres and sort of training and things like that. And that went on through the winter.
Were you still in touch with the Communist Party, or was there any contact with the Communist Party then?
Who?
The
Then?
soldiers, yeah.
No, not then, they didn't.
So you lost touch with the Communist Party?
More or less, yeah. There were some in the unit who were, but we none of us were. There was no real contact with them. And then, I think it must have been in 1940. The division started moving, and one brigade. The whole division started moving, and we were going to Finland to help the Finns against the Russian, and that was very confusing because we couldn't understand how, if we were fighting the Germans, we could go to help the Finns, and the Germans would be there helping the Finns as well, and we were supposed to be fighting the Germans. And then there was a big movement amongst the soldiers in the division, so the party must have been active, to desert when we got to Finland. But we set off and we were on our way. I think we were at Amiens or someplace. And the Finns surrendered and that war was over. And then the Germans attacked Norway, and one brigade of the division went back to England and went to Norway. That was the 17th Brigade. And the other two brigades stayed in France. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, before we could get back to northern France, to the Belgian border, the Germans attacked Holland and the Belgium and so on. So we had to rush back, and we were back in action by the 9th of May. And So in the first place, I think it was a place called Hal, which is where the Battle of Waterloo was, that we first met the Germans. And our division held. It didn't retreat, and we held them, but the Belgians retreated on one flank, and I think the French retreated on the others, and we had to withdraw. He'd gone off stealing eggs, and when they came and said he was wanted to go out on his ambulance, I said, oh, he's gone to the latrine, you know, he won't be long. And they said, well, he's wanted straight away. I said, well, he won't be long, he's only gone to the latrine. And they said, well, get your kit, you go instead, you see. So I said, well, all right, you know, got my tin hat and a small pack, and off I was going. And Vic came back, and he had the eggs in his hat. He said, where are you going? I said, on your bloody ambulance. I said, he said, no, you're not, it's my job, that. And he puts that down, grabs his hat, and off he went. 10 minutes later, the message comes back, been dive bombed and they were all killed. It was him, the driver, and 5 patients. And they're buried in a little cemetery at a place called Secklin near Lille. I went to the cemetery. They're all together, 7 British graves. But, you know, that was it. He was a regular soldier, and he and I were friends from when he came to the unit, and we'd always gone around together, you know. So very sad. And then, of course, we went into action and had to retreat each time because of the flanks retreating, not because we were losing. And they had tanks and things like that, but we were a very good British. We were an infantry division, and they didn't have anti-tank guns. They had anti-tank rifles, and they were successful in defending against the tanks. You got ordinary artillery, which the 75, the British artillery was quite good, and it was successful, and it was a well-organised, well-run division, and they succeeded and held the Germans up. And when they retreated, we couldn't understand why we were retreating, because we were successfully holding them and so on. But then eventually it got worse and worse, and people lost their way and got left behind. I got left behind in a place and picked up.
So how do people get left behind, though? I don't understand. If you're all fighting in a group, how do you get left behind?
We were retreating, and we were ready to set off from this village, and my friend Paddy Reddock said we'd better get some water for our bottles. We went in a house to get the water, and because the Germans were getting closer and there were no infantry in front of us, and they piled in the lorries, and some shells fell on the village, and they went, and I don't think they realised they'd left some behind, and they'd left us behind. When we came out, there was nothing there, nobody. No, you know, we thought, what the hell do we do now? And then, and the lorry came out of nowhere, I don't know from what direction, and it was from a 252 Field Company of the Royal Engineers, and they stopped and they said, what are you two doing? And we said, well, we don't know which way to go and what to do. Our units disappeared, and they said, well, it's no good staying here, we've just blown the bridge, and there's nobody behind us except the Germans, so if you've got any sense, you better come with us. So they gave us a rifle each and said, get in the back of the lorry and you can come with us, you see. So we took the lorry, and then when we got to Dupin on the coast, there were people stopping the lorries and saying, you got to wreck your lorry and dump it in the ditch, run the engine till, drain the oil out of the engine and run the engine till it seizes up and destroy the engine and so on. So they had to do that. But they had a lot of pontoon boats on this lorry, and we took those down to the beach. And that's when we discovered that we were evacuating. So
So how long had the evacuation been going on? Did you arrive late? Or
I don't know. I don't know how long it had been going on. This must have been about the 28th, 29th of May when we got there. But we'd marched 30 miles the night before to get to this place where we got left behind, actually. And we'd gone through the German lines, I discovered later, because we did that in the dark. And if anybody lit a cigarette, there were snipers shooting at you, so they learnt not to light cigarettes. And then we made up these boats, and that's when, you know, eventually Paddy said, well, we're not in the Royal Engineers, you know, and we've not got a unit or anything. Next time we make a boat up, we may as well go. And he said, go for that destroyer over there. So we got in the boat and filled up. There were about 30 other or more soldiers got into it, and the water was about that for but it was perfectly calm, so we managed to get to the boat. And we got to the boat, and it was a destroyer, and he picked that thinking it'd be safe. Anyway, so we get onto this destroyer, all the sailors helping us onto the destroyer, and then we had to go across the destroyer, and there's a bloody old Dutch tramp steamer called the Beale. So we get on this thing, and it not one gun on it, and so on. So then we had to get organised and using rifle fire and that to try and keep the Germans off, you know, when they came dive bombing it, which they did a few times. But when the rifle fire scared them away, they went off and they bombed a hospital ship instead of it and sunk it, actually. But there you are. And then eventually we got to Ramsgate.
So how long were you in Dunkirk for then, on the beaches? And not that long then, by the sounds of things.
I don't know, about 36 hours altogether. Not too bad.
So it wasn't difficult.
Yeah, but we went to Dunkirk itself. La Panne is farther along the coast. It's where that's where the sand dunes were and all that bit. And of course, the shallow boats that we were making up, which were the pontoons that they used for river crossings, the engineers, they only had a very small draft, so they could get right in and get out. And we got a lot of ships loaded that way. We had no idea that what was going on at Dunkirk itself. I mean, that was under fire just the same as we were.
But a lot of people spent like a week in the dunes, didn't they, waiting to get off, or a long
Well, I don't know. Some did and some didn't. It depended a lot of when they got there and so on. But we got there very late. I mean, it was over by the 1st of June, and this must have been, I got away on the 29th, 30th of May, you know.
Oh, so you were a few of the last people out then?
Not the last, but we were towards the end, I should think, yeah.
And when you got to England?
Well, when we got to England, all you did is
or-
you went off the train and went off the boat. And
Or was it attack the boat on the way back?
it was attacked by Germans, yes, yeah, machine gunned and
What, by
bombed.
plane?
Yeah, Stuka dive bombers attacked it. And I got slightly wounded, but not much. Not enough to worry about. And as I say, we fired at the planes with rifles. That's all we had, and I think there were a couple of Lewis guns on the ship as well. But it's a rifle fire that they don't like, because soldiers aim all over the place, and that's dangerous for aircraft. I mean, if the ones who could shoot straight were in great danger, because they don't take account of how long it takes from the bullet to get from the gun to get where they are, and by the time it gets there, they're gone. But people who can't aim all over the place, and they run into the bullets, don't they? They say. Where else were we? Then we got home. Then whatever train you got on, it went somewhere. And most of the other lads from the field ambulance and my company, they ended up in South Wales. And Paddy and I, we ended up in Worcester, in the Worcester barracks. And we were very well treated, and the Worcester Regiment were very, very good to us and looked after us very well indeed. They gave us somewhere to sleep properly in a bed, which was very unusual for the army, and we had proper medical inspection to see if we were still fit enough. And that was it. And then we just had to try to find out where the hell we belonged to and where we had to go. And they tried to keep us in, unsuccessfully, because as fast as they kept us in, we used to climb over the wall or go out into town and so on. And there were lots of pubs that were offering free beer, so obviously you couldn't avoid not taking advantage of it. So off we went whenever we could, and eventually I somehow went home. I thought I'm fed up with being messed about, so I went home. And my mother had got a telegram to say I was missing, believed, killed, and she said she didn't believe that. So I said, well, why didn't you believe that? She said, well, I had a field postcard from you the same day. You must have been all right. I said, well, I wrote that 6 weeks ago, so, you know, that's probably not true. And then the next day I had my calling up papers for the RAF. And I seriously thought of going. But then I thought they'd probably arrest me and shoot me or something awful. So I didn't. And then we ended up back in Scotland. And I think it was much worse than Dunkirk because the training was horrible. I think because the Germans outfought us and outfought the French. They were using, we were using 1914-18 style warfare. You know, they have the trenches, and then behind the trenches you have the supporting elements and the artillery, and the medical organisation was just the same, where you had an advanced dressing station, and then you had a regimental aid post with each battalion, and everything was very neat and tidy, you know. The Germans didn't seem to believe in that. They just drove through everything, you see. Not upset everything. So, and also we didn't have the defence even. The anti-tank guns couldn't, you know, the shells bounced off their cardboard tanks. And, you know, in general, and also we didn't have the air support. And there were very subtle propaganda all over the place. And they would tell you that next time you go in action there'll be plenty of RAF support, you'll be all right. And of course nothing turned up at all, so it had the opposite effect, and it was quite deliberate. That.
Deliberate by who?
Hmm?
Deliberate by who?
The people who spread the rumours. They'd spread rumours that everything would be all right, knowing bloody well it wouldn't be, so that the effect on morale was even worse.
But who would be spreading rumours?
The fifth column, all sorts. There was, you know, it was rife. The French would tell the British that they are, you know, it was a confusion, and the fifth column were everywhere, and the Germans had lots of, not within the British, but within the Belgians and the French. You couldn't rely on them not to be, you know, completely. It was very difficult, you know. The French came out with the British and left Dunkirk. They were evacuated with the British that were fighting. Calais fell, and we lost the 51st Highland Division there, lost the British division there. So I think that you've got to face it, the Germans, they outfought the French and the British, you know, with their tactics and their organisation and so on. And I think their coordination of air and land was better than ours. They could call on at that time, they could call on their air force, like the dive bombers, the Stukas and people like that, to knock out strong points. We didn't have such things, you know. We did later in the war. We beat them in the end, but not at the beginning. I mean, Johnny Longstaff, who fought in Spain, you know, a friend of mine who was in the civil service, he was in the party as well, fought in Spain. he left, when he came back from Spain, after the Spanish Civil War, he went to join the British Army. And they wouldn't have him because he'd fought in Spain. Well, that's, you know, that's fairly common, isn't it? The British would take on fascists, ex-fascists, and God knows what. But if you'd fought in Spain and showed that you really were against fascism, and, you know, they were doubtful about you. And a friend in my company, Chapman his name, Tony Chapman, he went up for a commission, and they... He told me when he came back, he was, you know, in a bad temper. And we said, what's wrong, Tony? You didn't you do any good at your interview? And he said, no, not that. He said, I'm getting a commission. So we said, well, good, you're getting a commission. He said, yes, but the reason is the wrong one. He said, when I was there and I was telling them about Spain, and he fought in Spain, he said they weren't a bit interested. You could see it, not a bit. And he said, then one of the officers who looked into his papers, he said, oh, you went to Winchester, did you, Chapman, you see? And he said, and it was my bloody school that got it, not what reality. He said that, you know. And he was a nice bloke, was Tony Chapman. But the other one that we lost from the company was a chap called Dowler, I think his name was. I think it was Dowler, I'm not sure. But he was Polish, you see, and he escaped from Poland through Russia and got back to England, and he was half Polish, half British. And when he got back to England, he got called up. And because he was a doctor in Poland, they thought put him in the British Medical Corps. And because they didn't recognise the Polish degree, he was a private soldier in our company, you see. And we were in Northern Ireland at the time. And, and suddenly one day, he suddenly said, I'm Polish. Oh, bloody hell, I'm Polish, you see. And we said, for Christ's sake, shut up and go to sleep. We don't care whether you're bloody Polish, what you are. He said, no. I need to stay in this bloody army so I can get out. So we said, well, get out, but let us sleep, you know. So on. So anyway, when he'd calmed down a bit, we talked to him, and he discovered that he could claim to be Polish, you see. So he claimed his Polish citizenship and immediately got a commission as a doctor in the Polish army, got out that way. But lots of us wanted to get out of Ireland. We had a bad colonel at the time.
Is that the reason?
No, it was the reason we wanted to get out of the unit. Yes, the unit was good, but the colonel was awful. And we had the most awful colonel came to us that we'd ever known. And he really was bad, but he was...
But this was Churchill trying to shake up the army, wasn't it?
Well, the whole army was we hadn't got an effective army. We had to get one quickly, and our division was one of the best divisions, and it had to be brought up to its full capacity. And it was not just us that had the train; everybody had it, and so on. But as somebody wrote I was reading it the other day. He said that we suffered the training, but we were glad of it later on when we had to be able to use it and when it was needed. But we were fit, so fit that it didn't matter. You know, you could sleep out in the open at night and you'd get new and so on. And then we left Southport and went to Northern Ireland. And again, I'm not sure what the purpose was, because without knowing the overall reason for things, looking back, I think it was because the Americans were going to come, although we didn't know that at the time or anything. Well, the Americans didn't come into the war until we were in Northern Ireland, and we were in Northern Ireland, and I can remember when the Germans...
didn't go to Africa yet then?
Pardon?
You didn't go to Africa until after the Americans were in the war, then?
Well, no, the Americans came whilst we were in Ireland, and this was Christmas 1940 was in Southport, and then after Christmas we went to Northern Ireland, so it's 1941. We were in Northern Ireland at the beginning, and then I forget when it was, but the first thing that happened that gave us, Britain, an ally was when the Russians were attacked.
Mm.
And then I can remember that everybody really was bucked up spirits, because although we were good as soldiers in the British Army, we didn't ever think that we could beat the Germans on our own. And we needed something, because they were the most powerful army you could imagine. But when the Russians came in, I think we all realised that at last the war was taking a turn for the better. And Pearl Harbor came after that. But then we were still in Ireland when Pearl Harbor happened and the Americans came into the war. And then the first Americans that came to Britain came to Belfast after we'd left Belfast to go back to southern England to prepare to go overseas again. And I can remember them because we left behind a few soldiers who had to get out of hospital and get well again and come back to us. And when they were convalescing or waiting to come back to us, the Americans were there, and the Americans had money to burn and the British had nothing, and so these lads used to be very kind to the Americans, and if they went to the NAFI and had any food, they offered to clear away their dishes for nothing, you see. But what the Americans didn't realise, they'd paid a deposit on their knife, fork and dish, you see. So they were clearing away and making more money in a day than they got in a week out of the Americans. That didn't last, because they then came back to us. And we then were in Bletchingley in Surrey, and not far from Caterham, where the guards are, and the division was all round there, and the other troops round there were the Canadians and the Americans, and we were just getting ready to go overseas. That's all it was, and we were getting all the equipment to go overseas, and a bit daft, really. They did all sorts of things to convince the spies that they thought they were around that we were going to perhaps Iceland or going somewhere cold, you know, and then they'd issue topies to suggest we were going to a hot country, and then they'd go back to painting the steel helmets white to suggest we were going to where there was snow, you know, and things like that. All work, and nobody was convinced at all. And then, of course, I often think of it, one of the most miserable journeys in my life was to go from there, and we had to march about, with all the kit and everything, about 3 miles to a railway station, carrying everything, and get a train to Greenock to get the troop ship to go overseas. And we went on this troop ship up there about 3 o'clock in the morning, not a bit like the pictures, nobody with bands and nobody waving you off and no pretty nurses or anything like that, you know, nothing like that. Raining and drizzling and cold and miserable, and 3 o'clock in the morning you feel more like sleep than anything. So we eventually got stuck on this troop ship. It's called the Franconia, and some bright spark in the War Office had decided it would be clever to put a whole brigade on one ship. So you can imagine there were 3 battalions of infantry, there was the artillery, there was the Royal Engineers, there was a medical corps, there were the division, brigade headquarters, all the, you know, the Royal Army Service Corps, all the troops on one ship, and it made a total of something like 4,500 to 4,800 on the ship. And of course, the accommodation, just impossible, you know. I think we had 288 in the mess deck that at its most had ever had 144 before, you know, something like that. So we used to try to sleep anywhere, and if you could get a good spot under a table or on a table, you were lucky, you know. And then when it got, then we sailed from Greenock, went across the North Sea and down the American coast. We did it to avoid the Atlantic because of the U-boats, and it was a massive convoy. It had escorts and everything. It had an aircraft carrier with it as an escort, so it must have been a very important convoy.
So where did it go exactly? Where did it sail? Where did it sail?
Well, it went down the coast of America and then across...
America?
Down the coast of America,
How did
yeah.
you get to America? You had to cross the Atlantic.
Across the Atlantic, and down the coast of America, and then back across the Atlantic to Africa, to Sierra Leone. But we didn't go ashore there. And that's where this colonel I'd said about, he was an out-and-out fascist, he was. And he had us all on deck, and there were the natives come out with their boats selling you fruit and things like that. And he was saying, they're worse than monkeys, these people. They're subhuman, they're this, and, you know, parading up and down. Of course, you can't say, you don't say a word. And he ordered two of the lads from the company to turn the ship's hoses on them and so on. And they refused. They said, no, that's their living, it's their goods and so on. And he stuck them in the cells for about 7 days for refusing an order. Eventually somebody half-heartedly squirted them and couldn't hit them, or didn't hit them, more like it, and he gave up in the end. And the rest of the soldiers, like the infantry and the others, they were buying things off them, and he just gave up because obviously he was up. But he was a very, very unpopular man. And then after Sierra Leone, the ship sailed on, went to Durban. We were supposed to stay 5 days in Durban, but we were only there about 36 hours. And the contrast there with all the lights and all the goods and everything beautiful in South Africa, you know, was wonderful. But the worst of it was the apartheid, and I'd never seen apartheid before. And I thought it was so disgusting. And the thing that always stuck in my mind was that you had this immaculate white policeman, you know, walking along on this pavement, you know, being welcomed by all the South Africans and friendly with them. And the poor black policeman, he had to walk in the gutter, you know, not allowed to walk on the pavement. And the South African behaviour towards them at that time even was deplorable. It was really full apartheid, and we'd been warned we had not to do anything at all to upset them, and not to even comment about it and anything. And it was said they're only just in the war on our side, you know, so we don't want any danger of losing them. You know, they were only 51%, you know, in favour of being on Britain's side at that time. Anyway, we didn't stay 5 days, we stayed 36 hours. And the 36 hours, we were back on the ship, we were recalled, and then we sailed out, and we had to get all the equipment out from the baggage room and everywhere. When the crisis came at Dunkirk, that's when the Labour Party came into government and started, you know, became like you had, I think, they had ministries that were run by Labour, and it was Labour, Conservative, all parties. It was a national government. It wasn't run like that.
But you talked about the part of the Tory party and the establishment who would willingly work with fascists. But the anti-fats, the people around Churchill, how was Churchill seen, and what was Churchill's history? I don't know. I don't know much about Churchill, except
the danger was there were lots of the top Tories wanted to do a deal with Hitler. Halifax and some of the others wanted to make peace and go with Hitler, and you know, to go against the Soviet Union. Really, that was the basis of it, and that's, what was it, 1941? No, 40, wasn't it? When he attacked Russia, and Russia became our first ally. It was very revolutionary, that, because our cook brought tea up to us in the barracks and to tell us that at last somebody else was on our side. That was revolutionary indeed. Never brought us tea before, but that happened. But the other thing that I always thought was funny, that up to then, at the 9 o'clock news on the radio on a Sunday, they used to always, prelude to the news was playing national anthems of all the countries against Germany, even though they were overrun, like France, Belgium and so on. But when the Russians came in, everybody waiting, are they going to play the International? And they didn't. They decided to stop doing it. And that was so obvious, it was laughable. But
the thing is, I mean, it seems to me the Communist Party, the time England had a massive empire,
yeah,
and England, and also I think most of the establishment was racist and anti-Semitic.
yeah,
and the Communist Party was the opposite. It
yeah.
was to have links with Paul Robeson.
Yes, that's right.
And
Yeah,
with Paul Robeson would come and sing.
yeah.
And also presumably there was a lot of Jewish people
In the Communist Party.
Yeah.
Oh yes, it was. Yeah. So we landed at Madagascar and took it from the French, and it was no great. The French gave up quickly. They didn't want to fight, and very few casualties from the fighting. But the casualties from malaria was horrendous, because when we finished there and sort of occupation troops took our place, because we weren't intended for that. We were intended for Burma. And they took our place and we sailed on. Well, we buried 5 soldiers who died of malaria at sea on the way to India, and carried off about 350 casualties at Bombay. And we didn't have any supplies. We didn't have any anti-malaria things at all. We didn't have mosquito nets. We didn't have anti-malaria cream. We didn't have any quinine to treat malaria with, and so on. And the medical corps was working. Every member of the medical corps on that ship was working all out, as many hours as they could per day, just looking after the soldiers that had got malaria and treating them without the essential drugs, and just didn't have it. But it took 7 days. Then the ship ran out of water because, of course, it didn't have enough supplies to meet the casualties of malaria, or to meet the requirements of 4,500 troops who needed water themselves and so on. So they had to ration water, so there was no water for washing and showers and things like that. So it didn't apply to the officers so much as the men. That they continued to enjoy a rather nice trip. That's what we thought anyway. Bombay we landed and then went down to a place called Ahmednagar in the Pune area, and we were at a armoured vehicle training place where we had to deal with armoured vehicle casualties and things like that. None of us liked it. I think we all felt claustrophobic when about dealing with little tin boxes on wheels like that. And then, because of all the malaria and the division being made unfit, it was decided we wouldn't stay in India. So we set off again, and this time to go to Persia. So in the case of our unit, we went on a trip ship called the Lancashire, and it was, I think it should have been scrapped years ago. It was such an awful ship, and everybody loved it because it had a lovely spirit of it, and people liked it. And we were travelling with Indian troops as well, and they all had their charwallahs with them, brewing up tea, and there was a lovely atmosphere on it. And
What's a charwallah?
Indian that serves tea round the back. Charwallah is.
Officers had their own charwallahs, yeah? Officers had their own charwallahs.
No, charwallah is more related to the troops. The officers would have batmen looking after them, but everybody in India, soldiers in India, did quite well because you had Indians who would look after you, uniform, Dobi Wallah, who looks after all your clothes and make sure that's all nice. They'd even shave you, and it's reputed they could shave you while you were still asleep and you wouldn't know it. They did all the things you want, but the charwallah, that char is where you get the idea of tea. They always used to have their big tea urn, and they'd be going round the camp and sit there dishing out the tea. And India was very enjoyable. All the troops that ever went to India liked India, and they liked the Indian people. And our division had a reputation of getting on with the people, but not with the authorities, because when they landed in India, the officers were told that they couldn't use the clubs because they didn't have whites for their evening meal. But we discovered afterwards we were the first real fighting soldiers that had ever been to India, so nobody knew what to do about it, you see. After all, they were officers, but they didn't have whites. So they relented and said yes, they could use the clubs, but they'd put a screen up so they couldn't be seen. So a little bit of anti-British apartheid. And the officers and that didn't take to India very well because they were much more democratic than the ones who were already there. But then they were a breed apart. They were the colonial types, weren't they? They're the ones who looked upon the Indians as not being, whereas we related to the Indians and got on well with them, and we talked politics to them. We talked about the Congress Party and about Gandhi and people like that because we were ordinary soldiers. We weren't regular soldiers. We were sort of citizen soldiers, I suppose, really. And I once asked an Indian what was their policy, and he said to get all the Indians to spit at once to wash the British into the sea. And so I thought that's what he thinks of us. And then I worked in an Indian General Hospital, and you had to work with Indians, and they were very, very good. I enjoyed it. I always liked the Indians. Anyway, we left there and went to Persia, which was, I would not recommend it. It was the worst country I would ever seen in my life, I think. And it was full of real hardship. The weather was awful. Terribly hot in the summer, unbearably hot in the summer, and unbearably cold in the winter. And it was full of disease. It had typhoid, typhus, diphtheria, smallpox, and all the other little ones like the desert sores and things like that went with it. And in the medical corps we were very, very hard looking after people. We weren't in action, we weren't fighting anybody. We were working with the Russians, with getting goods to Stalingrad mainly. And on the ship going there, our company officer had got us all on the deck, and he'd said, "You're now going to be working with the Russians, and we want no problems from you lot. We don't want any comments about the Russian equipment or anything like that, because the British Army is the finest equipped expeditionary forces there are. But the Russians, they may not be as well equipped as the British, so you mustn't comment on it. You must get on well with the Russians, and that's it. I don't want any trouble." Well, after we'd been there about 4 months, and it was 20 below zero, and we were living in tents, and and we had 6 sheepskin coats to share amongst us. One of the lads went to the company officer and he said, "Here, sir, why can't we be as badly equipped as the Russians? Because they all had fur coats, fur hats, and they were equipped for the cold, and we weren't." But there it is. But I got diphtheria in Persia, and I was about 3 months in hospital. And
what sort of goods were being supplied to Russia then? What sort of goods?
Well, there was a company called the UK Convoy Company, and there were the railways running across, carrying tanks and guns and armaments and shells, everything you could think of. Mainly armament supplies for the Russians across there. And that's why it was important that we got to keep the Germans out of Persia. And it's important that Stalingrad didn't fall, because if Stalingrad had fallen, the Germans would have had access into Persia, into Iraq, into the Middle East, and that was a big danger. So we were there in case there was a breakthrough at Stalingrad. And thank God there wasn't, because we'd considered if there was a breakthrough at Stalingrad and the Russians had 36 divisions in reserve, what would one British division be able to do? Except run in the other direction, I suppose. Anyway, eventually we left there and went to Baghdad.
Did you make any friends with any Russians?
Yeah, I did. I met some in hospital and got on very well with them. And when I came out of hospital, I wasn't fully well. I'd managed. The colonel had asked if I could be released from hospital because the company was leaving Persia, and this wasn't the colonel that. Had it been the old colonel, I'd have said, "No, I'll stay in bloody Persia rather than go with you." But this one, he took over on Christmas Eve, and it was the greatest thing, greatest good that had happened to us in 3 years, that we'd got rid of that old colonel and we got this new one, and he was Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, and he became a hero overnight when he came to us, because he promptly started acting like a human being and considering the men first and the soldiers. And he got to be really, I suppose he was really loved by everybody, because he was a good man and he was a first-class soldier. If we had to do a 20-mile route march to see if we could, go into an attack and still be able to take action at the end of a 20-mile, and did it, he came with us. The other bugger would come and see us in his staff car. That's a subtle difference, and so on. And he would share all the hardships with us, and he really was good. And he was good in the way that he realised training was essential, but it had to be sensible. And he immediately changed. You've got to remember, it was so cold and 20 below zero and living in tents, and the other colonel used to have us out at 6:30 in the morning on physical training, with shorts and running around and things like that. And the first thing he did is, when he was told that this was the order, he said, "Well, forget that." He said, "Reveille will be at 7 o'clock. He said, "And before breakfast, if they want to have a kick around with the football in battle dress, they can do it, but no, forget that." And then he said, "First parade, 9 o'clock," and so on. And immediately we realised we got somebody who you could relate to. And he stayed with us for quite a while. Well, then we left Persia and we went to Baghdad for a while. And I liked Baghdad. It's a wonderful place. Ice cream was marvellous. I'd never seen such ice cream in all my life. And then from Baghdad we went across the desert to Damascus, and then we did mountain training in Damascus, living in the mountains and training, and lots of hard work on marches, climbing mountains, drills, medical duties, things like that. And then we went to Tripoli, in Tripolitania, not the other one. Tripoli in, next to Beirut, that one. And that was to do landing training from landing craft and things like that. Then from there we went to the Bitter Lakes in Egypt to do more training in landing craft and landing. And then we got the boat at, I think it was Port Tewfik, sailed up the Suez Canal, and everybody had been told we were going home. And they were all jeering at us, you know, look at buggers going home and so on. And we were going to Sicily to land on Sicily. We couldn't say a thing.
I thought you were in North Africa at some point, though.
That was not. I got to North Africa after Sicily. I was evacuated there when I got malaria.
Oh, okay.
But we then sailed on a ship called the Franconia, which was a ship that was built by Horbelisha when he was a Tory war minister, and he had some funny ideas about treating people well and having ships that had, you know, decent air ventilation and things like that. And it didn't go down well with the rest of the government, I don't think, in those days, but he did, and it was called the Danera. And it was a lovely ship, and the accommodation was comfortable and everything. And we sailed, you know, up the Suez Canal, then along the Mediterranean, and landed in Sicily. And as we were going in to land on the beach at Sicily, there were the gliders that hadn't got to their destination ashore to secure the bridges because the American tow planes had cast them off when the Italians had shot at them with their anti-aircraft guns, which, you know, has hidden a lot, such events. And anybody who was in Sicily knows all about it, where the cost to them was that a lot got drowned and a lot landed badly and were killed. But the cost to us was that every bridge and everything that they should have secured was not secured, so they had to be fought for, which improved the casualty rate, or extended the casualty rate. Anyway, I was in...
The Americans landed as well as Sicily.
The Americans landed and were supposed to have protected the flanks of the 8th Army going up the coast of Sicily, but Patton decided he was a reincarnated Roman general and that his destination was Palermo, so sort of bugger the 8th Army, I'll go to Palermo, and left our flanks and so on, and our casualty rate went up accordingly because we were fighting against the Germans, who can fight when they want to. And it was hard in Sicily, and casualties were high, and there were some very, very good British divisions there. 51st Highland Division and the 5th British Division were there, and I got malaria in Catania, outskirts of Catania, so I didn't go into Catania. I was evacuated then to North Africa, went to Algiers, and by the time I got to Algiers I was almost well again, but a few days still in hospital, and then I had to get back again to give me, you know, a tin of bully beef and some biscuits and say go back to your unit, which by then was about 2,000 miles away.
Where were they then?
Well, after Sicily, they invaded Italy and went up the east coast of Italy. Up,
So where did you rejoin the unit then?
I rejoined it in Italy,
Which part of Italy?
Foggia, but at that time, I joined it at Foggia. At that time, I had a difficulty finding them because they disappeared because they were moving to join the American 5th Army from the British 8th Army, and they were covering up the move by disappearing, and the divisional sign, you know, like the white Y, had all been taken off, so nobody was wearing the divisional sign, and they put a 7 on in its place. Of course, I didn't know that, and everybody wondered what division's 7. Nobody had ever heard of it, you see, and the idea was to fool the enemy that that the 5th Div had not left the 8th Army. And I was just about to give up and go into a transit camp, and I saw a little 15 underweight truck with a white Y on it, and I waved it down and said to the driver, "Where's the division I'm supposed to..." He said, "Well, it's very hush hush, I can't tell you that," he said. I said, "Well, what, you've still got the sign on?" He said, "Oh yeah, well we're coming later," but he said, and so he said, "What are you with?" So I said, "Oh, 164th Field Ambulance." So he said, "Well, you come back and stay the night with us," and he was with the reconnaissance, 5th Reconnaissance Regiment, and that's where Bill Alexander was, with Mondragone, just north of Naples. And I was just saying that when we got there, it was obvious that it wasn't just for a rest, because all the roads were being piled with ammunition cases, you know, every so many yards along the road, and the infantry were all checking their bayonets and having them sharpened and made sure they didn't have any serrated edges or anything like that. And we were getting all the supplies up to be sure we had enough supplies to treat casualties and so on. And this was in January 1944. And by mid-January, of course, we put the attack across the Garigliano River. This was during the Battle of Cassino, and that's Cassino's inland, and this is towards the coast, and the river, of course, is quite wide as it gets towards the coast, and the river crossing was quite a difficult one. And the Germans held the mountains overlooking it, so it was very difficult indeed. So we were under fire most of the time. And with the river crossing itself, that had to be, this is after the infantry had secured the land up as far as the mountains. The crossing had to be covered with a smoke screen all the time, otherwise, even with the smoke screen, it kept getting hit with shell fire, and the engineers had to replace the damaged boats and rebuild the bridge a few times. And that was, I at that time was working on an American ambulance from the American Field Service, because our ambulances were too big, couldn't get through the mud and things like that, and we were using the American Field Service ambulances. They were a Dodge 4-wheel drive ambulance and could get anywhere. They were very powerful. And the American driver wasn't an American soldier, or he was a volunteer, and they were in what, I think it still exists to this day, American Field Service, and they have a museum in New York. I'd love to go there and see it. And we were working on up to the river, taking casualties back to a main dressing station at Mondragone. And there was a brigadier saying he wants more vehicles across into the sort of land that had been secured across the river, and he said to us, "Get across the river, you see." And the American said, "Well, what do we do?" And I said, "Well, he's a brigadier, I'm just a stretcher bearer, you better go across the river." And so we went across the river, and then we worked up to the, was an advanced dressing station with the, I think it was the Cameronians at that time, and we worked on that, and I worked with him. And I don't know what you want this for, but it's pretty horrible. I mean, at the crossroads, for instance, where we had to drive, there were 5 German bodies, and nobody could get near them to move them or anything, so every time we went round the crossroads we had to drive over them. And they were being sort of pushed into the ground just by the traffic over them.
Why couldn't people get near them? Why couldn't they be buried?
Because nobody wanted to get killed going near them. It was being shelled all the time.
Oh, I see.
And on one occasion we were going round, and we'd given a lift to an American correspondent,
Mhm.
and he'd said, "Where's this goddamn shooting match?" And he's chewing a cigar. I don't even know whether it was lit or not, but and so on. He was a bit like some actor from some horrible American movie, And I said, "If you get in the back, we'll take you there." So he got in the back of the ambulance, and of course, the MP stopped us and said, he said, "They're shelling the crossroads," and he said, "I've worked it out." He said, "If you wait till 2 shells drop and then you belt round as fast as you can, you should miss the next 2.
Mhm.
Well, he was wrong. I don't know what would have been right, but we waited till 2 shells dropped, and then we belted like hell, and just as we were going round the crossroads, 2 more dropped, one each side. And of course, when I looked round, this American correspondent was on his face and he squashed the car and so on. And we were just belting on. Well, he got to his shooting match all right, and so we dumped him there, and then picked up another load of wounded and had to go back again, you see. But I think he didn't stay long. He got back as fast as he could. I think he'd found his shooting match. But anyway, that continued, and then we went back once, and the driver said, the American said, he said, "I've got to go and get petrol and check the vehicle and so on." And so I said, "Well, when you return, pull in near those vehicles there," because we'd gone off rations. We hadn't had rations for about 12 hours, and we were off rations for about 48 because of some mess up with supplies. And they were loading rations for the division next to us, for the 48th Division. And so when he came back, he pulled up next to these vehicles, and I went and told some Italian prisoners to stick the rations in the back of our vehicle, you see, and went back. And when I got back, I went to the company commander and I said, "I brought the rations up for you." And so he said, "We're off rations." He said, "Where did you get the rations?" And then he said, "Oh, well, forget that." And so he realised I'd stolen them, you see. And then we took another load back again, and we took them this time right the way, instead of just across the river and offload to another ambulance, we went straight back to Mondragone. And whilst we were there, he said he had to go and see his people about whether he was staying on this duty or not or something, and he said he'd be about an hour. So I went and had a shower, rash all around my stomach, and there was an officer in the next shower, a bit like in MASH, you see it, where field ambulances, they work very well. The officers and the soldiers get on very well together. And I said to him, "Oh, what the hell was that then?" And he said, "Herpes zostes, old boy, herpes zostes." So I said, "Christ, is that bad?" He said, "Well, shingles is what you might call it." I said, "Oh, thanks." I said, "What shall I do about that?" And he said, "I don't care what you do." He said, "You're not in my company." I said, "Oh, good." He said, "Well, where are you?" I said, "I'm up with B Company." So he said, "Well," he said, "Sea Captain Dow, I think it was, or something." He said, and tell him you got herpes zostes." So he said, "When you go back, tell him that." So I went back with the empty ambulance, and went into, and I said to him, I said, "Captain," Dupe, I think his name was. I says, "I've got herpes zostes." He said, "Well, is it painful?" So I said, "Well, it is really, with the belt and equipment on." I said, "It's not very nice. It is painful, and it's getting worse." He said, "Well, take another load of wounded back and stay back yourself. Send the ambulance back." So I took another load back, and this time they were all battle casualties. They were candidates to be shot in the First World War. Really, they were all they panicked and got all shell shocked and so on. I took them back. By the time I got them back, I was as bad as them. Actually, I felt it was the same. So I had to stay, and I went into a casualty clearing station to be treated for shingles. when I went back again, just in time to go back into the bloody line again. But this time I was on stretcher bearing and wasn't working on an ambulance. And I much prefer working on ambulance. It takes less energy.
Was luxury, isn't it, on an ambulance?
Hmm?
Well, what did you do? Did you do the driving, or did you do?
No. I had a driver. I was to look after the patients. I make sure they got back safely, and didn't bleed to death or anything tragic on the way. You know, our casualties have been so high. We thought we were going to go home. And they withdrew us from the line, and another division took over. The American division, the first one we'd ever seen in the American Army. It took over. American 2nd Division took over. And we'd never seen one before, and we were in the American 5th Army, and it had French, it had Poles, it had even the Italian Garibaldi Brigade, it had the Gooms, it had the British. The American 5th Army, an army and a division. Don't confuse the 5th Division British with the 5th American Army. It's an army. An army consists of corps and divisions and brigades and the lot, you see. But anyway, this American 2nd Division turned up, and they took our place. And when they turned up, for security reasons, so the Germans wouldn't discover there was an American division there, they came with British vehicles and British uniform, wearing British steel helmets and the lot, so they couldn't be told that they were American. And of course we rather unkindly said if the Germans discovered the American, they'd be through them like a dose of salts, and that's why they probably didn't want it, but that was our own interpretation. So we were withdrawn, and we went back towards, and then we were on the outskirts of Naples, and having a rare old time, nobody shooting at us, and enjoying life in general, going off, perhaps drinking too much, and so on. And then somebody came back, he'd been to Naples and he'd seen the division, he'd seen them going on ships, and they had kit bags, and they were going on, we're going home, he said, going home. So he comes back and it spreads like wildfire, we're going home at last, you see, we've had enough, we've been all this fighting, so on. And then our company commander decided he'd put an end to the rumours and so on, so he got us on a flat roof above a school where we were billeted, and so nobody could hear. He said, you've all heard the rumours about going on ships, and he said, and kit bags and all the paraphernalia, and you've heard all that. And he said, and that bit's true. He said, but the bit that's not true is you're not going home. You're going to the Anzio beachhead. He said, we're going to relieve the 56th Division, who've been sadly mauled about very badly by the Germans. And he said, so we got 7 days. He said, there'll be minimum duty, minimum guards. And he said, make the best of it. Enjoy yourselves while you can. But we had not to tell anybody what was happening. And so we did enjoy ourselves. And we didn't pay any attention if there was a sign said out of bounds, because we said, well, prison would be better than going up there. And the MPs had been told to ignore us if we did anything wrong, so that didn't do us any good either, did it? And there it was. So we eventually got on these American, no, it was a British one we got on, tank landing ship we went on, took all the things, the vehicles and all our stuff on a big tank landing ship, and went off to Anzio, and then landed there, and from all the niceness of near Naples, we were back in a field again, sleeping out and making the best of it. And then it got worse as time went by. Casualties were high, and the work wore us down, so I don't think many of us were very, very well, really. But since we were all alike, we didn't recognise it. I think we were all very nervous, very worried about everything, and
what was Anzio like?
Well, it was so awful that it's difficult to describe. We had to work, and the sector that our brigade was in was called the Fortress, and It was called a fortress because it wasn't a fortress. It was a clump of bushes on a little hill. And it got called a fortress by some wit, and it stayed a fortress. And it had to be held because if the Germans got it, they could overlook an awful lot of our land and make life a misery for everybody. And it had to be kept. And the casualties in keeping it were terribly high. And our job in the field ambulance to do regular stretcher bearing duties with the infantry. And we liked the infantry immensely and got on well with them, and they got on well with us. But the job itself was very, very difficult indeed. And we had a lot of casualties ourselves. And when we had casualties, that was one less to do the job. So that in the beginning, when we were at full strength, we were doing, 12 hours up on stretcher bearing, you might get 2 days back. You get unsympathetic to your patients because there's so many, and sometimes they were so badly wounded and so on that you couldn't afford sympathy. That wouldn't do you any good. I didn't remember. Strangely enough, I met a man that lost both feet on a mine, and it was in where Mum and Dad lived in that place in Bournemouth. He was Billy, his name was, and he'd lost both legs. And he was in the Wiltshire Regiment, and probably he said that I was one of the stretcher bearers that carried him out. And he could have been, for all I know. I wouldn't remember. But there it is. No, I wasn't attracted to it, no.
It must have been terribly difficult to deal with the wounds and things.
Well, you can only...
seen the really horrific side of war. You must have seen the real horror of war.
Well, you do, and you become immune to it, actually. I'd reached the stage where I'd convinced myself I couldn't do anything to stop whatever was going to happening, so therefore, don't waste my time worrying about it, so I didn't. And I think a lot get like that. So, but you don't take chances, you still get out of the way if you can, you know. But
there was a few times you were nearly killed, wasn't
oh yes, several times, yeah. I mean, one occasion at Anzio, we'd gone to relieve another group, four stretcher bearers with the infantry, and some bloke said he knew the way, and we got lost. So I was senior then, and I said, no, we'll go back. You're lost. You don't know where you're going, and it's dangerous. So we'll go back. So we went back, and I said, we'll stay the night. And we stayed the night near the road in the field. And I woke up next morning, cold as anything. And one of them, when we got back, had said he'd dropped the rations. Well, we were carrying rations for 48 hours for the four of us. And he dropped it, the stupid sod. So I was so cold about 5:30 in the morning when I woke up. I thought, well, I'll retrace where we went and see if I can find them. And I thought, I bet it was by that waterfall or something where we were, and so on. I went back there, and I found the rations there, and they were in a sack, and the bread was all wet, so I threw the bread away, kept all the tin stuff, and set off back. And dawn had broken, and it was light, and a shell landed in front of me. And I thought, what the bloody hell is shelling at this time in the morning? And then one landed behind me, you see. And I thought, oh Christ, it's me. So I started running, and another one landed a bit closer in front, and another bit closer behind. And suddenly it twigged it. I thought, next one will be here, it'll be me. So I dived into a ditch, and it landed just where I'd been. And I crawled out of the ditch and went back. And I thumped the bugger who dropped the ration. I'd never hit anybody before, but I did that time. I was so angry. I said, nearly bloody killed me, you bastard. What did I do? The nearest point was about 40 yards away from them, and about 100 yards in other parts, you know, and mortaring and machine gun fire and things like that. You got to learn how to avoid it if you could. Well, you had to avoid it, didn't you? And we had a truce with the Germans that every 3 hours we could evacuate people over the open ground, because that's the only way we could evacuate them. And I went to Anzio, the cemetery, to find a grave of somebody who was killed with me, and he was Sergeant Dean, a nice chap from Warrington. And just before he got killed, he said he'd been in all the actions, and he said, you think I've been in every action with the division since the beginning of the war? And he said, not a scratch. He said, nothing. He said, I got the military medal. He said, I've got a lucky star. He said, I reckon I'm all right. And one of the lads said, you shouldn't talk like that, you know, superstitious like. So he said, come on, it's 3 o'clock. He grabbed the Red Cross flag and went up out of this wadi, up the side of it, dried up riverbed, you know. Went up the side with the Red Cross, and just as he got to the top, a mortar bomb fell next to him and he was killed. And I was following him. I had to grab the flag and stand there and wait till the others came, you know, carrying the stretchers across this open land and so on. And when we came back, I don't know what had happened. Somebody had taken the body away, and I never saw him again. But the Germans sent a message across to say that they were sorry about that. They said the bomb was in the air when he went up. They said they didn't. When it was fired, there was nobody there, and you know, that's what they said. And we took it that was true, because it was obvious. You know, a mortar bomb goes up and comes down. It takes time. They must have fired it just before the time, and he was a bit perhaps premature going up there, and that was it. So I found his grave, and it looked very nice and so on. But that went on all the time, and the casualties were high, and our losses were high, and the infantry weren't particularly. They were having a rough time, and it went on and on and on until in June, about 6th of June, of course, same day as D-Day, of course, we took Rome. But the Americans wouldn't let the British go into Rome. They wanted to go into Rome. And that's been criticised as well, because they shouldn't have gone into Rome. They should have gone inland and cut off the Germans so that they didn't escape after the Battle of Cassino, which, of course, there's a lot of people written about that since, that American generals tend to look for a place in history rather than win the war. Anyway, after Anzio, we'd finished, and the division had finished in Italy, and we were withdrawn, and we went down back near Naples, and we were in a field, or I think it was a olive grove, and we were in this olive grove, and it rained, and it rained, and it rained, and we had no shelter, no tents, nothing at all, and we didn't care a bit. At least we weren't being shot at. That was the main sentiment we felt, and we tried to shelter under the trees as best we could, but we ended up sopping wet in the morning, and nobody complained. No, nobody worried about it. We thought, well, we're alive and we're out of it, you know. And then the company commander said to myself and somebody called Kane from Manchester, and he said, would you two like to go to the opera this afternoon? And we said, oh, yeah. So he said, it's Rigoletto by Verdi. He said, it's San Carlos. And he said, if you can clean yourselves up and look respectable enough, he said, you can go. And he said, I'm on duty, otherwise I'd be going. He said, so you two get me tickets for tomorrow. And he said, I'll give you the money for that. So, well, money didn't matter anyway. And so we did that. And we cleaned our webbing, and we polished the brasses, and we tried to get the creases out of our shirts and shorts and polished our boots and presented ourselves. And he said, well, yeah, you do, you can go. And he gave us the tickets, and we went into Naples there was a truck going in there, and went to the opera. And the one thing I always thought to this day, we felt ashamed of ourselves, because compared with the base troops there, who had lovely clean uniforms and looked smart and tidy and things like that, we felt we didn't come up to it, you know. And so anyway, we saw Rigoletto, and it was wonderful. I learned after the war it was Dennis Healy who was the man who got the opera going again in Italy for the entertainment of people. He was the beach officer at Anzio, actually, and he did that. In Taranto, we were wandering round, and there was a massive sort of hall packed with people, and Johnny and I went in and wondered what it was. We thought it was a concert or something, and there was, but it was a Communist Party, Italian, PCI, and they were having a concert. And when we went in, they said, oh, come in, you know, and made us welcome and everything. And that was the only contact we had. But then we sailed next day for Palestine, and then we were in the desert outside Palestine somewhere, and we had to get reinforcements, and we had to get fresh equipment, and we had to get training and marching and all back again to get fit again and get up to strength again. And there were 13 of us. We had to get our first class tradesmen, so we had to go to a general hospital, and they sent us to Beirut. Well, we couldn't have cared less whether we got our first class or we didn't, because what the hell, threepence a day we get if we so on. And in Beirut, of all places, sort of playground of the Middle East it was. Of course, we then had to work in a general hospital for 7 weeks, and at the end of 7 weeks take an exam, because it's quite it's about equivalent to state registered nurse, you see, when you get it. But we didn't really worry it and so on. And we had to do all the work in the various wards and learn. But then we found that we didn't have to learn much, because one day they said, because every bit of spare time we were down in Beirut swimming and going to the cinema and going to the bars and things like that. And they, you know, they'd say, afternoon leave's cancelled, you've got to be shown how to give an injection. Of course, we all roared with laughter. We said, what do you mean, to be shown how to give an injection? What the bloody hell do you think we've been doing in Italy? You know, we've not had any nurses with us like you lot, you know. We've been on our own. We've been doing it and so on. And still we had to stay and watch them how to do it and so on, and learn all these things. And then at the end of the 7 weeks, of course, we did it. But we didn't, it was a pity, we didn't get on very well with the other medical corps soldiers in the general hospital, because they didn't seem to know what life was like in the medical corps that we knew it. It was quite different for them. They only were at the far end of the train.
Job.
Yeah, well, they lived a very pleasant life. They had a bed to sleep in every night, and they had food 3 or 4 times a day and things like that. It was all right. I never wanted it. I didn't ever want that sort. I liked to be with the field ambulance. I enjoyed it, and they were good lads and so on. Anyway, we got our qualification and went back to Palestine, and then we sailed again and went back to Italy. And then we landed, I forget where we landed, Salerno. When no fighting there then. We landed there, and we were around Pompeii in that area. And the camp, we weren't allowed out at all. But then eventually we sailed again and went and landed in southern France. And it was one of these quiet moves where we weren't allowed to wear medal ribbons, we weren't allowed to wear wound stripes, we weren't allowed to show anything that gave the idea that it was a experienced division, because they wanted to move it for the Rhine crossing. And they moved us across France, and we went across as Canadian troops. We weren't convinced, I don't know about the enemy. And we ended up in Belgium, and the Belgians' reaction was, when we arrived and nobody had any medals and nobody had any wound stripes, and the Belgians immediately came to the conclusion, must be a very big crack in British division, that, because they didn't show anything, so it didn't work. And I was in a place called Destelbergen, and working there, you know, I used to do lots of the sign writing for the unit, and making signs and working in the workshop. And I was enjoying life, living in a civilian billet, you know, with a proper bed, and people fed you, and lovely. And I was going back one day, and I was going to go to the pictures in Ghent with some girl in the village, and that night. And I was thinking about it, walking home, and somebody said, Sergeant Major wants you. So I said, I haven't done anything wrong. He said, I don't know what you've done. He said, but he wants you anyway. So I said, oh. So I went and saw him, and I said, did you want me? He said, yeah, get your kit together, you're going to Germany. I said, I don't want to go to Germany. He said, well, I don't care whether you want to or not, you're going to Germany. Go tonight. I said, just me? He said, no, not just you. He said, there's 11 others. I said, 12 of us? So he said, yeah. So I said, oh, wow. So anyway, we went to Germany, and that was that same evening. We ended up in bloody Germany, and we were in a village, and we were the only ones there. There were only 12 of us, I ask you. And all these German civilians, and typically, we worked ourselves up into a state expecting them to attack us. And so we had to do a guard, and I unfortunately lost, and I had to be one of them going on guard. So 3 of us out of 12 had to go on guard. And when we drew lots for who would do the first 4 hours, I won, so I could do the first 4 hours. So I had to do from 9 o'clock till 1 o'clock. So
That's the best, isn't it?
well, of course, I got the rest of the night to go to bed, haven't I? Go to sleep. The worst one is the 1 o'clock till 5 o'clock, so on, you see. So anyway, I thought, well, that's not bad, so I just carried the rifle slung over my shoulder, and I carried the ammunition in my greatcoat pocket, and wandered around the village and see if everything was all right, and the lads were still up playing cards and talking and so on, and of course that was all right until it got to about 10:30, put the lights out, and it was pitch black and so on, and then I started worrying. I thought, and they'd been talking, and they said, I bet she's a bloody Nazi, that girl, she'd chuck a grenade at you as soon as look at you, things like that. And I thought, yeah. Anyway, when Smith, the driver, came to relieve me at 1 o'clock, he said, what's wrong with you then? Because I got me back against the tree in case anybody, so nobody could get behind me. And instead of having the ammunition in my pocket, it was in the rifle, and one was up the spout, and the safety catch was up. I was ready to shoot anything that came near me. And then nothing ever happened. And then we went on into Germany, and then we had one big last...
Why were there just 12 of you in this village?
We were on the advance party to get ready for the others who came on. You always have to have an advance party, get things ready, get the billets and arrange for them. Mm-hmm. Later on, in April, end of April, we had to do one last attack, and I think to this day that was awful. That they should take a division that's fought for 7 years virtually and put it in a last attack. I mean, after 7 years, surely they could have left them out of it for once. It wasn't necessary and so on, because we had casualties. And Very sad ones
So when
too.
was it? When was that?
End of April, beginning of May 1945, at the end of the
Right.
war. The war was over virtually. The Germans were running like hell. We couldn't keep up with them. But they had to attack this bloody village, and they did. And there were 18 Cameronians were killed for a start. And we were with the Wiltshires. And the Wiltshires, I don't know whether they had many casualties, but they were one of the more mild regiments, less demonstrative, less aggressive and so on, but very good soldiers. And on that attack, they went in with flamethrowers, with everything they'd got, and they were determined they weren't going to get killed at the last few weeks of the war, or the last few days of the war, virtually. And then my birthday was on May the 7th, and on May the 8th the war was over and we'd finished. But then we had a lot of work to do with the German wounded, which were all over the place, and when it all ended, I wasn't very conscious about what happened to us, because we had a base in Goslar, but a lot of us were sent all over the place. I got sent to a Northamptonshire regiment, Northamptonshire regiment as a medical orderly to work with them for a while, and completely out of my scene. I didn't know them or never heard of them before, and a friend of mine who lived in Truro, now dead, he ended up working for ages on German hospital trains trying to clear their wounded that were being brought back from the Eastern Front and so on. And we had a lot of hard work clearing up the casualties, and also we were busy trying to catch the SS, and they were hiding as patients in hospitals, and we used to have to sometimes raid hospitals and make them take their pyjamas off and to see if they had tattoos on them as SS, and catch them that way.
So what was Germany like at the end of the war?
Beautiful, lovely place. We liked it. German people, no passes, no baddies. They're all gone. I don't know where they've gone to. Never met any who even voted for Hitler. But then, when the war had ended and things did settle down, we ended up in Goslar, and things settled down. It was very quiet and very nice. And I think it was shortly after the war ended, it must have been quite shortly after, they had the general election. And at that time, in every unit, there were quite a few communists, and they were pretty well organised, and we weren't in contact with England in any way. And we decided that on the policy, and we just decided the policy should be, don't vote Tory, don't vote Conservative, get rid of them. That's what we want, get rid of them. And there were all sorts of parties they could vote for. There was the Beveridge Commonwealth Party, there was the Communist Party, and they didn't have many candidates, unfortunately, and the Labour Party, Liberal Party, and we said vote for anybody but don't vote Conservative. And I edited the unit newspaper at the time, and the funny thing was that we had the meeting, decided that we'd run the politics when the officer in charge, they always put an officer in charge to make sure you behaved yourself when it was something like newspapers and that. And he had to go with a party to Yugoslavia to deliver some medical supplies. And when he went, we then brought it out like that. When he came back, we reverted to the chit-chat about the unit. And I met him, funny enough, at a congress of the Communist Party in London after the war, going into it. And he said, "Gosh, you!" I said, "Yeah, it's you, isn't it?" So he said, "Why the hell didn't you run more politics in that newspaper?" I said, "We did." He said, "No, you didn't. I never saw it." I said, "No, we waited till you were away." And he said, "Why?" I said, "You didn't expect us to trust officers, did you?"